Death on the Burnt Ocean. The Tales of the Territories. Book 1. By Peter Wacht. Narrated by Benjamin Fife. Chapter 1. A Disappointing Hunt. "Can't you run faster than that, soldier?" The man standing guard at the entrance to the tower, a very large blacksmith's hammer held in his hand, had to bend down to fit through the doorway without banging his head. He was glad to be free of the confining space as he stepped out onto the grass. He didn't like being locked away from the outside and the fresh air. It made him edgy. "You need to lay off the ale, Bertie. It's all going to your gut." Bertie huffed and puffed his way up the slope, the once muscle-bound figure, now going a bit soft around the edges, was no more than a shadow in the descending grey mist. For just a second, the man by the door, the hilt of his sword peeking out above his shoulder, thought that Bertie was carrying 3 large sacks across his broad shoulders. It wasn't until the soldier turned farmer was less than a dozen yards away that the large figure in the doorway grinned, finally able to pick out what Bertie was hauling. "You try carrying 3 children up that wretched slope, Duff," muttered Bertie. He struggled to catch his breath as he let down the 2 daughters who had been slipping from their perches as he sprinted up the hill. He kept the youngest, a boy no more than 2 years old, with his hands twisted tightly in his father's hair, on his shoulders, as he ducked inside. "Is Winnie here?" "She is," Duff replied, giving Bertie a friendly slap across his back for his effort, as the man passed by him, glad that he had made it. "Almost everyone else from the village is here as well." "Not all?" asked Bertie. He turned back through the entryway, the sun on his shoulders pulling with greater vigour on his hair, obviously frightened as the thin wisps of white began to darken to a thicker grey. Bertie carefully extricated what few strands he had left on his head from his son's tight grasp. It wouldn't be long now, so they would need to be quick. "Do we need to go back out?" Duff smiled, nodding his thanks for Bertie's generous, likely suicidal, offer. Bertie was a brave man. Duff had seen it with his own eyes more times than he could count. The soldier in Bertie had never really left, just as had been the case for him and so many others in the village. But there was a key difference between them now. Bertie had a young family. Duff didn't. If anyone went back out into the encroaching fog, it would be him. Only him. "We should be all right," replied Duff, giving Bertie a gentle nudge so that he would follow his children into the tower. "Why don't you go find Winnie and see what kind of trouble those twins of yours have already gotten into?" Bertie snorted at that. "You've got that right. Nothing but headaches from sun-up to sundown. That's why I spend so much time in the fields." Duff chuckled, hearing the love in his former corporal's voice. With Bertie and his family now safely within the stone broch, Duff turned his gaze back to the valley that stretched out below him, the valley that was disappearing slowly before his eyes, beneath a smothering blanket of thick fog. It wouldn't be long now, Duff mused. He chafed at the circumstances he and the other Highlanders had to deal with, yet they had no choice. Another night hiding in the fortified tower, an occurrence that was becoming all too frequent. How long they would be locked away was anyone's guess. Just the thought of it was making him itch. This was no way to live. He had journeyed across the burnt ocean from Caledonia for the freedom and opportunity that could be found in the territories, not to be shut away cowering in fear whenever the fog descended. He studied the encroaching grey mist as he had done so many times before. It looked no different than the fog he had played hide-and-seek in as a child, while growing up near Rue's nest. But it was, because this fog didn't come off the ocean. Although the sea of mist was just a few leagues to the east, This gloom drifted down from the north, no doubt having started out in the wild. It then tracked the coast through the northern peaks, all the way across the northern steppes, finally settling here, deep in the northeastern Highlands. It was an unnatural gloom, heavy, deadening, and with a much too light touch of dewy moisture compared to what you would expect from a mist coming off the sea. The sun couldn't brighten the haze once it fixed in place, and with that suffocating fog came a sense of palpable evil lurking within, an evil with very sharp claws. Duff wasn't a superstitious man by nature, not after all that he had seen fighting in Caledonia and beyond his kingdom's borders. There was little that frightened him, and almost nothing that could take him by surprise, because he had seen it all before. At first he had scoffed at the stories that he had heard from farther north when the fog had first appeared, more than a year before. More like nightmares, actually, likely told by those knee-deep in their cups. He began to believe when that fog made its way into the Highlands with a startling regularity. The fog that some had begun to call the murk, claiming that it was actually an extension of the terrifying gloom that covered the wild land far to the northeast. He knew for certain that the tales were true when he glimpsed the hazy figures for himself, those nightmares becoming flesh and blood. Tall and lanky, the monsters in the mist were no more than vague shapes. No one in the Highlands had ever gotten a good look at one, and if they had, it had been right before they had become one of the creature's many victims. And they certainly weren't in a position to reveal their attackers' secrets. Although not well seen, these monsters were well known. These beasts radiated a sense of menace, a sense that they cared little for life, that they cared only for taking it. The Wraiths. So named by a trader who had made the long journey from the wild, and explained that's what those poor souls living in the coastal cities just south of the murk called them. The monsters that hunted in the fog. The monsters that couldn't be seen unless they wanted to be seen. The monsters that couldn't be heard. The monsters that couldn't be killed. They were silent assassins, the remains of their bloody work visible once the gloom drifted back to the north. No one caught out in the open when the fog settled over the land had yet survived. The only way to avoid a gruesome and terrifying end was to find a strong, defensible shelter before the thick grey tendrils blinded you. A shelter like the broch that Duff stood in front of. When the murk had first appeared, a delegation of Highlanders led by Duff had gone to see the governor of the territory. Appointed through a grant given by then King Corinthus Belleron, Torsten Sharperson, a younger brother of the Duke of Sharston, had listened to their entreaties with a smile on his face. He had spoken the appropriate words of support. He had offered his condolences for the people murdered by the creatures that came with the fog. The Callow lord had assured the people for whom he was responsible, and from whom he collected taxes, that he would study the threat and do what was needed to protect against this new, unforeseen danger. That study apparently was still ongoing, as Duff and the others had seen or heard nothing more from their supposed lord since, or at least that's what the tax collectors said. The Highland Guard was nowhere to be found, and those greedy bastards who picked every coin out of your pocket appeared with greater frequency than the murk. When they did, they sought more than just a pound of flesh. It had been a wasted effort, Duff knew. Governor Sharperson was little more than a thief in a lord's clothing. Duff stopped himself, his mind always going down a road better left untravelled when he considered how badly the governor had failed his people. Besides, he was giving thieves a bad name. Most of the thieves he knew at least had some sense of honour, a set of rules they played by. Torsten Sharperson made up his own rules as he went along, changing them whenever the whim or necessity took him. In reality, he was no different than any of the other nobles granted territories by Corinthus Belleron. These lords and ladies who played as governors in New Caledonia operated by one simple rule: what's mine is mine, and what's yours should be mine. Just thinking about the Highland governor's response, or rather the lack thereof, made Duff's blood boil. Several dozen people murdered in just the past year by these wraiths, and nothing done about it. Not a single thing. "Are they here yet?" Duff turned toward the worried, crinkled face of Martin, the blacksmith who lived at the edge of the village and served the surrounding region. He had gathered his family and gotten to the fortified tower at the first signs of the fog, the bell atop the broch, ringing loudly and echoing off the surrounding peaks to warn those living in the valley of the rapidly approaching threat. Martin was worried. He had yet to see any sign of his sister or her family. They lived farther up the slopes to the northeast, their goats and sheep enjoying the grass at the higher elevation. "No, not yet, but I'm sure they'll be here soon. They always make it." Martin nodded, taking a deep breath to calm himself. He too was a former soldier in the Royal Guard. The idea of a fight never fazed him. He would take on any man or beast without a thought to protect his family, even though he knew just as Duff did that you couldn't fight the monsters that stalked the fog. Not with any hope of surviving. In the murk, for all intents and purposes, you were blind, unable to see more than a few feet in any direction in the billowing grey. The wraiths could hear you, the wraiths could see you, but you couldn't see them, and often you didn't hear them, until their steel or claws slid into your flesh, because the wraiths moved as if they were a part of the fog, while you stumbled about. The wraiths were meant to be there. The Highlanders weren't. If Martin had to enter the fog to look for his sister and her family, he would without a second thought. But he wouldn't be marching toward a combat. He would be going to his death. There was no good way to defend yourself if you couldn't see what you were fighting. The Highlanders had learned that quickly, and they had taken what action they could to protect themselves even faster, not caring to wait for help from a governor who seemed to have little interest in helping them if he couldn't help himself at the same time. They modelled their defence on a series of small fortresses that Duff had visited while serving near the trench. They built more than a dozen brochs in the northeastern Highlands, each roundhouse tower situated in the centre of the larger Highland communities. Each broch had a single entrance with a 3-foot oak door wrapped in steel, hinges on the inside with slots for 3 steel bars to be set in place once the door was locked. The antechamber narrowed to half the size of the doorway the farther you walked in, so that a broad man had to turn to the side to walk through, an essential modification to ensure the safety of those taking refuge in the tower. If somehow the creatures of the murk broke through the door, one soldier could easily hold the narrow gap. To make the passage even more lethal, slits in the wall on each side allowed for spears and pikes to be thrust through, making the entryway a death trap. Once past the entrance, a spiral staircase wound its way between the inner and outer walls, connecting the galleries on each level that served as temporary shelters and storerooms. Each broch was 80 feet in diameter and 100 feet in height, the walls always 10 feet thick. Halfway up the towers there were narrow slits for archers, the spaces so small that not even a child could climb through them. On top of the tower was a large pyre, the fire used to signal other brochs before the murk consumed the flames. More important was the massive bell that could be heard for leagues around, and was the first warning that the creatures lurking in the mist approached. There was also space for archers to fire, and a pile of large rocks that could be dropped from the parapet. Useful defences against more conventional foes. Not so the wraiths. Few Highlanders remained atop the parapet when the fog came in, the creatures having an unnatural ability to scale the stone with their clawed feet and hands. When the bell sounded, the inhabitants of the brook usually closed the thick shutters and ensured that the door that let out onto the roof, designed just like the main entrance below, was bolted and guarded. Then they waited, for however long it took. The main entrance wouldn't be opened again until the fog cleared. "Sally!" yelled Martin. "Hurry!" The blacksmith had caught the faint movement in the thickening fog, his sister appearing out of the grey. She ran up the slope as fast as she could while holding onto the hands of two of her children, almost dragging them behind her across the large green that surrounded the tower because they were struggling to keep up with their mother. Martin ran out and picked up both children, hustling them through the door. Benyon, her husband, came right behind her, a small child under each arm, like he was carrying sacks of wheat. The boy and girl were laughing and giggling, obviously enjoying the ride, not seeing their father's ashen face and the spark of fear behind his eyes. "They're already out there," he whispered. "How could you tell?" asked Duff. Because of their ability to move without being seen and without making a sound, the wraiths usually couldn't be identified in the murk, unless they wanted to be. When they wanted you to know that they were watching, that they were waiting to kill you. "I could feel them," Benyon replied. Duff nodded, not questioning his friend's explanation. He was a former tracker in the Royal Guard. He had explained to Duff once, while they shared an ale in the only tavern in this small village, that much of what he did as a tracker wasn't based on what he saw or heard, but rather on what he felt. Admittedly, they were both quite sloshed at the time, but Duff had never been a tracker, so he was in no position to dispute his friend's answer. And he had yet to come up against an instance when Benyon's feeling hadn't been right on target, both in Caledonia and here in the Highlands. "Where's Mary?" asked Sally, standing in the doorway, fear and desperation for her oldest daughter colouring her voice. "I thought she was here with you," said Benyon. "You didn't bring her from the house?" "I thought she was with you," countered Sally, a look of terror spreading across her face. "Where was she before the bell rang?" asked Duff. "She was tending to the goats along the ridge to the northeast," said Benyon. A sick feeling settled in the pit of Duff's stomach. That was the direction from which the fog had come. From the direction it always came. The retired sergeant cursed silently. "You all get inside. I'll get her." "I'll go with you," said Benyon. "I can—" "You can move faster than I can, and more quietly," continued Duff, taking in his friend's slim frame, that seemed to allow him to move with a speed and grace that he had only seen one other time, several years before. Duff hadn't wanted to attend the gladiatorial games in Tintagel. If truth be told, he had seen enough blood and gore for a lifetime, and had no desire to see any more. Even so, he didn't want to explain that to his friends. They were quite intent on taking in the spectacle, so in the end he acquiesced to their demand. Strangely, when it was over, he had valued the experience. Not for the unnecessary violence and slaughter. No, that had sickened him. Rather, it had given him the chance to watch the Falcon fight, the wolf, the greatest gladiator in the land, and much to his surprise, a young man at least a decade and a half younger than he was, who exhibited the seasoning and savvy of a hardened soldier. It was an experience that he would never forget, and it had confirmed for him that it was time for him to move on, to leave Caledonia and the army and make a new life for himself, some place where he could avoid the fighting that, although he excelled at it, he had come to dread. The fighting that, unfortunately, seemed to have followed him across the burnt ocean to his new home in the Highlands. "But I don't have a family," Duff finished with a strong hand on Benion's shoulder. "You do." "She's my oldest daughter, Duff. I can't leave her out there." Duff gripped Benion's shoulder a bit more strongly, hoping that his bruising grip infused a sense of confidence within his friend, making sure that he caught Benion's eyes and kept them on his own. "You're not leaving her. I'm going to get her." Benyon stared at his former sergeant for several seconds. He had known Duff ever since he had joined the Royal Guard. Usually, his sergeant had a smile on his face. When there wasn't, then you knew that there was going to be trouble, and you never wanted to get into trouble with Duff. Duff wasn't smiling now. His hard expression just made the man more frightening than he already was, inadvertently aided by the wound that he had taken across his scalp, that extended from the back of his head around the left side to just beneath his jaw. The hair had never grown back where he had been sliced open, so Duff kept his head shaved. Thanks to the magus who healed him, the wound was just a very thin white scar, rather than a jagged patch of flesh. It still proved to be unsettling to look at, however. Benyon always wondering how his friend had survived such an injury. Duff had told him once that it was because he had such a hard head. After getting to know Duff, Benyon had believed him. It was because of that Benyon finally nodded, then stepped back. Duff was the toughest man he knew. He would bring Mary safely to the brook, or he would die trying. Duff returned the nod, then stepped out into the billowing fog. "Tommy?" "Yes, Sergeant," replied a slim woman wearing spectacles. She, too, had served in the Royal Guard with Duff, along with many of the other men and women in this Highland settlement. Archer by trade, some said that she could hit an ant at 100 yards. After watching her in a skirmish against a band of brigands, no one was willing to challenge that assumption. "Is that the last?" Tommy looked at the paper she carried, running through the list of the families quickly. "Yes, Sergeant, that's the last." Duff nodded, then started walking down the slope toward the northeast, calling over his shoulder, "Lock it up!" "But, Sergeant—" Tommy never had a chance to complete her protest, the fog swallowing Duff after he had taken only a dozen steps. Growling in irritation, Tommy stepped back and then called to Benyon and Martin for help. Together, the three of them pushed the heavy door in place, locking it, then settling the 3 bars in the brackets across the oak and steel. Turning away and heading up the spiral staircase that led toward the balustrade, Tommy wanted to check the door that led to the roof to make sure that it was just as tightly sealed. As she did so, she wished Duff well and hoped that she would see her sergeant again. Even so, Tommy was a practical woman. She refused to allow her hopes to get too high. Few ever survived the murk, especially on their own. To be caught in the fog was a death sentence, likely even for Duff, a man who should have been dead, but apparently couldn't be killed. "Why didn't I follow my brother when I had the chance?" Duff wondered as he slowly, ever so slowly, navigated down a steep, narrow path that led to the long grass along the cliffs that Benyon's goats preferred. He could barely see where he was walking, moving more by memory and touch than sight, as the grey mist swirled around him. His brother had received a grant from the king to settle the Western Isle, which was just off the coast of the Ferenach territory, and on the other side of the continent. Maybe that's why he hadn't made it out there yet. It had been a long trip across the burnt ocean. Duff had gotten tired of the storms that seemed to strike every other day, sending the merchant vessel dipping into the troughs and then surging over powerful crests. much to his displeasure, his stomach mimicking the motion of the ship. That and those massive wakes that he had spied from the crow's nest. Thankfully, those creatures swimming through the sea were not interested in his ship, because if they had been, he knew the likely result. Because of all that, when he landed in Ballinasloe, he had no desire to get back on the water. Instead, he had decided to visit with several of his former soldiers who had settled in the northeastern Highlands. He had thought that he would only be in this rugged, beautiful land for a few weeks at most. The urge to leave Caledonia, the desire to see more of the territories, pushing him farther west. Yet in just a few days, that desire to move on had gone quiet. He had been in the Highlands for almost 5 years now. He liked it here. He liked being with his friends, and he couldn't bring himself to leave, in part, because of the murk. When that cursed fog rolled in, and with it the terrors that it hid, he couldn't make himself go, even though it was the smart thing to do. Of course, Duff had never been accused of being too smart. He had been accused of being too stubborn, of failing to give his superiors the respect that they believed they deserved, of offering unwanted opinions, of refusing to accept orders from fools, and of several other faults that he tended to ignore or forget when doing so was convenient. But he had never been accused of being too smart, and he had never been accused of running from a fight. In consequence, he was still here with his friends, making a good living as a hunter and trapper, and helping out whenever they needed it, whether with the flocks or the crops, or wayward children caught out in the fog. He stopped again, just as he stopped every few steps, spending more time listening than moving, seeking any sign, no matter how small, that a wraith might be near, because the wraiths were always near when the murk came. About to begin his downward journey again, Duff heard a scrape maybe 10 feet to his left. The noise sent a shiver down his spine. He kept 1 foot above the ground, not wanting to give himself away, not wanting to cede the advantage of surprise just yet. He had his sword strapped to his back, and several large knives on each thigh. He liked to be prepared for anything, but his weapon of choice was the large hammer that the fingers of his right hand gripped almost delicately. The thick wooden handle tapered to the steel head, a weapon and implement that many a blacksmith could barely lift, much less swing with any effectiveness. In his hands, however, the steel felt right, as if it was meant to be there, and was simply an extension of his arm. A faint shadow coming down the gentle slope drifted toward him. He could see nothing from the knees up. He pulled back his arm, ready to strike, his focus solely on the threat that approached. His shallow breaths thundered in his ears. A cold sweat ran down his back. Then a soft bleat released the tension that had been building up within him, and he had to fight not to laugh with relief. A goat trod carefully down the rocks, rubbing against his leg in welcome as he passed. Duff closed his eyes in thanks for just a second. At least he knew that he was close. With this fog, in addition to worrying about the wraiths, he feared that he might walk right off a ledge. Wanting to avoid that possibility, he allowed the goat to precede him, showing him the way and hoping that the animal's movement would mask his own approach. Duff continued along the trail, slowly, carefully, vigilant with each step, doing all that he could to ensure he didn't make a sound. Once, he thought he saw a large shape coming toward him from his right side. That froze him in place, but he couldn't even be sure that he had seen what he had thought he had seen. The figure passing through the fog so swiftly. Then another shadow appeared, this one feeling more substantial. The tall silhouette remained there above him on the crest of the hill, not moving, not making a sound. Watching, waiting, hunting. Duff wasn't certain that the shadow was a wraith. Nevertheless, he couldn't be certain that it wasn't, and he had no desire to find out. He remained where he was even when his knees began to ache, then throb, the wear and tear of decades of military service catching up to him at the absolute worst time. He ignored the pain, knowing that it was nothing compared to what it would feel like to have a wraith's knife slice across his throat. Now he knew what it felt like to be hunted, and he would be the first to admit that he hated the feeling. He wasn't afraid to fight a wraith. It's just that if he was going to combat one of these monsters, he wanted to be able to see the creature so that he could have at least some possibility of success. In the murk, all the advantages played to the wraiths. If he were found, he was nothing more than a sitting duck to be slaughtered at a wraith's convenience. With those negative thoughts taking up residence in his mind, he stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, his eyes fixated on the shadow in the mist that was no more than a dozen feet away. As the minutes passed agonizingly slowly, he realized that he'd have little chance of getting a blow in with his hammer. If the shape in the fog was indeed a creature of the murk, then the wraith would be on him before he could even take a step with his rickety knees. His best chance was to grab a dagger from a sheath on his thigh, and hope that the wraith slipped coming down the slope and fell on him. That certainly wasn't a good way to win a combat, but it might be the only way in his current circumstances. Several minutes more passed before his patience was finally rewarded. The figure in the fog either moved away, disappeared, or was never there to begin with. Duff didn't care. The only reason he had been able to see the shape in the first place was because he was near the coast, and a strong breeze off the sea of mist had thinned out the usually dense grey. Still, he waited several more minutes before finally pushing himself forward, his aching knees screaming in protest. He ignored the pain, working out the stiffness as he continued farther down the trail, step by slow step. Every so often another soft bleat sounded to either side, confirming that Duff was moving in the right direction. As he stopped every few feet, the mist caressing him as he listened for anything that might suggest that a wraith was near, his thoughts turned to how to find Mary in the fog. He should have given that a great deal more thought before he left the safety of the broch. Her father had been an excellent soldier, a good fighter, smart, creative, disciplined, always prepared. The last suggested to Duff that Benyon probably had taught all his children what to do if they were ever caught out in the fog. Bringing to mind a mental map of Benyon's property along the cliffs, Duff thought of the most likely place where he would have taught his children to go. Somewhere, Benyon would have a camouflaged shelter or a place to hide. Then he had it. Benyon had shown him just a few months before while they were clearing a patch of ground so that he could expand his garden. There was a cut along the cliff that led down to a small cave. If you didn't know what you were looking for, you would walk right past the trail to get there. Duff continued down the path in that direction, moving no faster than his grandmother, who had 2 bad hips, would have, stopping and listening for a minute or more after taking only 2 or 3 steps. It was a slow process, nerve-wracking, but so far so good. No more menacing shapes appeared in the fog, and in just a few minutes the cut between 2 large boulders, one resting right in front of the other, appeared in front of him. He waited several more minutes before disappearing between the rocks, worried that a wraith might be watching him. The monsters in the mist were smart. They were also cunning. He didn't want to lead one of the creatures toward Mari if she was hiding here. Yet it seemed that his caution was unnecessary. No sound, no movement. There was nothing to suggest that he had anything to worry about. Duff continued down the narrow trail, walking very carefully, not wanting to make a noise with all of the loose rock beneath his feet. When he finally reached the end of the path, the dark mouth of the cave opening before him, he stopped sooner than he wanted to. Something wasn't right. He could feel it immediately. There was a presence ahead of him that shouldn't be there. An unexpected, though welcome flash of sunlight that broke through the fog and lit the first few feet of the entrance to the cave confirmed it for him. For just the blink of an eye, before the fog blocked the sun once again, Duff caught sight of a tall figure standing just a few feet inside the grotto. The incredibly brief glimpse still gave him a good look at the creatures who were terrorizing the Highlands when the murk came in from the north, or at least as good as he was going to get with the wraith's back turned. Unnaturally tall and thin, the wraith wore what Duff took to be a whitish-grey leather armor, its unprotected flesh shifting between shades of white and grey. He understood now how the creatures hid so well in the fog. Their natural coloring allowed them to blend in perfectly. What really drew his eye were the weapons that the wraith held between his exceedingly long clawed fingers. He had never seen anything like them before. 3-foot-long rods with a grip in the center, half-crescent blades on each, and curling in opposite directions. It was as if 2 long daggers had been melded together at the handle. Nasty piece of work, and certainly to be avoided. Then Duff realized that he wouldn't be able to. The wraith had taken another step deeper into the cave. Thankfully, the wraith hadn't sensed that Duff was only a few feet behind him. The creature's attention focused on the back of the hollow. That could mean only one thing. When the wraith took another silent step deeper into the darkness, Duff struck. On silent feet of his own, he rushed toward the wraith, swinging his hammer with destructive accuracy, the metal head crushing the creature's right knee. The debilitating injury did nothing more than elicit a hiss of pain from the wraith, the creature tottering because of the blow, though not falling to the ground. At the same time, the injured wraith swung his twin-bladed weapon behind him, hoping to catch Duff unprepared. The sergeant suspected that the wraith would make such a move. It's what he would have done in his place. That's why he was able to avoid the steel. Because he was ready, he knocked the blind swing away with his hammer. Before the wraith could turn fully, Duff pulled a dagger from the sheath on his thigh and drove it into the back of the creature's other knee. He had thought about trying for the wraith's lower back, then decided against it, not knowing if such a strike would kill the creature because of his armor. In his opinion, it was better to go with the sure stab and disable the wraith, who finally collapsed to his knees on the rocky ground. Duff swung one more time with his hammer, not wanting to miss such a good opportunity. The metal struck true, slamming into the wraith's head and sending him to the dirt. "Mary!" Duff hissed as quietly as he could. In just a heartbeat, she was there right in front of him, Benion's oldest daughter, all of 10 years old, ready to defend herself with a dagger in her hand. "Are you all right?" Duff whispered, kneeling down and hugging the young girl to him. "Yes, Uncle Duff," she mumbled into his shoulder, her voice calm. She appeared to be less upset about being out in the fog than he was. "Good, then let's go." Duff pushed himself to his feet, his knees protesting the entire time. He was about to head back outside the cave, Mary's hand in his own, when a tall, strangely thin figure that was barely more than a shadow coalesced out of the grey haze. The wraith stood in the entrance to the cave, Duff having a hard time picking out the creature. The fog had thickened during the fight with his now wounded, hopefully dead adversary. He did see the wraith blocking their way turn his head to his left, taking in the crumpled form of his brethren. "Mary, get behind me," Duff ordered gently. Mary complied quickly, her eyes widening in terror as the wraith took a few more steps into the cave, stopping no more than a spear's length away from Duff. Duff crouched, one foot in front of the other, hammer raised above his shoulder. He wasn't a fool. He couldn't be a fool to have survived for so long as a soldier. He was a realist. He knew just how fast and deadly a wraith could be. Therefore he had no illusions as to how this combat would end. He could only hope that he could create an opening so that Mary might be able to slip away. "You will die here." Duff stared at the wraith, stunned. Though some of the words were difficult to understand because of the peculiar accent, Duff was able to comprehend the monster. "Yes, that's a very strong possibility," Duff replied as calmly as he could, although his heart was beating so fast that he thought he was going to pass out. "You do not fear death," said the wraith, nodding, as if he had just made a great discovery, still having made no move to come forward farther into the cave. Apparently the creature wanted to have a conversation. Duff was more than happy to accommodate him, enjoying whatever time he had left in this world, while he searched for a solution to his dilemma. "I don't," replied Duff, who then clarified, "I don't want to die, but I don't fear it." The wraith nodded again, although Duff couldn't tell for sure, with the fog swirling around the figure. "The other humans I have killed have always begged before I cut their throats." "I won't beg." "Do you really want to try your hand against me? You took my comrade through deception. You will not do the same with me. Better just to accept your fate." "Looks like I don't have much choice," Duff responded with a shrug. "Better to fight than to surrender. You might kill me, but it will be on my terms, not yours." In the silence that followed, the wraith appeared to consider what Duff had said, then shook his head as if he had reached an important decision. "Then I will kill you quickly. You have courage. You deserve a swift death." Duff didn't know what to make of that comment. Should he be flattered? Should he thank the monster? He didn't have the chance to contemplate it further. The wraith burst forward, his movement so fast that Duff could barely track it. Still, he got his hammer square to his body, blocking the wraith's slash. Duff thought that he was doing well until the blade in the wraith's other hand sliced across his shoulder. Gritting his teeth against the pain, Duff pivoted away from the bloody steel, swinging his hammer toward the wraith's unprotected side. The creature leapt over the hammer with a remarkable dexterity, and immediately rushed forward again, Duff having some difficulty keeping up with the wraith's attacks. The retired sergeant survived the onslaught by blocking or avoiding the most dangerous strikes, and ignoring the dozen bloody slices that welled up with a deep red on his arms and across his chest. The wounds were shallow. He would live. For now. "You will die, human," said the wraith, stepping back, making sure that he continued to block the entrance to the cave, not wanting either of his prey to have the chance to bolt like a hare. "You're probably right," said Duff, seemingly unconcerned by the possibility. Before he could get out the rest of what he wanted to say, a streak of steel shot right by his head. Mary's throw wasn't perfect, but it was good enough, the dagger spinning through the air and slicing across the side of the wraith's throat. Not enough to kill the beast, the cut no worse than what Duff might do if he were trying to shave without a mirror. Even so, it was enough to distract the creature, and it was the unanticipated though very much appreciated chance that he couldn't afford to lose. Duff jumped forward, smashing his hammer into the wraith's hip, hearing the bones crack as he did so. For good measure, he drove his dagger in between the creature's lower ribs, just to give the collapsing wraith something else to worry about. Then he reached behind him, grasped Mary's hand, and ran out into the fog, hoping that there weren't any more wraiths waiting for them along the cliffs. Duff and Mary ran as fast as they could, which wasn't very fast, more like a trot, the fog thick and threatening, slowing them down. Duff's bad knees not helping. Duff didn't mind. They needed to be careful. Putting some distance between them and the two wraiths was good. Silence and another place to hole up, even better. Duff was trying to recall every aspect of Benion's property, having visited more times than he could remember. The house was too large and had too many windows for it to be of any use. It was also in the direction they had come from. The barn had too many entrances. He couldn't defend them all. The pens were too open. Mary started pulling him toward the east. "Where are we going?" "Just follow me." Duff had little choice, as no good solution came to mind. Besides, she was the one who had gotten them past the second wraith. As they made their way through the fog, he convinced her to slow down. Mary, anxious, wanting to move as fast as she could, desperate to get out of the open. Duff stopped her every few steps, worrying about what might be around them, what they might miss or give away if they moved too swiftly. It made for slower going, but better slow than to be taken by another of the creatures in the fog. It wasn't long before they walked through a copse, Mary leading them with her unerring sense of direction to a small cottage built into a cliff that was really no more than a shed, the structure falling in on itself. That didn't bother Duff in the least. The roof still appeared to be solid, not thatch, but wood beams, packed tightly together and filled with dirt, thick grass growing on top of it. The stone walls were still strong. Best of all, there were no windows, and much of the doorway was blocked by a large pile of rubble. "How did you find this place?" asked Duff, as they scrambled over the stones that rose to his chest. "I like to explore," Mary replied, sitting against the back wall, leaning her head against the cold stone, as if this was nothing more than a regular day for her. "Were you exploring today? Is that why you missed the bell?" "Maybe," Mary replied reluctantly. Duff nodded. "We'll keep that between us. How does that sound?" "Thanks." Duff peered out from the doorway, looking for any hint of movement in the fog. Nothing. What he wouldn't give for a storm right about now. It would drive out the fog and the wraiths with it. "Your father teach you how to throw a dagger?" Mary nodded, then grinned. "Said I was a natural." "He was right. If you weren't, we'd both be dead." Duff glanced to the left. Of course, there was still a good chance that they both still could die. 4 shapes had appeared, positioning themselves in a semicircle around the cottage, the figures drifting in and out of the swirling fog. As one, the 4 stepped forward, or rather 2 stepped forward. The 2 in the center hobbled. Duff shook his head in amazement. The 2 wraiths he had encountered in the cave already were back on their feet. Clearly, their injuries were severe. The first wraith he had taken down with blows to both knees could barely stand. The second leaned to the left side, trying to keep his weight off his shattered right hip, one clawed hand pressing against the wound in his side. Yet there he was. He could see the wraiths' faces, but he didn't need to. He could feel the hate radiating from them. The wraiths wanted another chance at him and Mary. So be it. This time, however, the wraiths would have to come for them while they were in a more defensible position, and that would give him an advantage that he hadn't enjoyed before. Duff prepared himself for the charge. It didn't come from the direction that he had expected. The wraith to his far left glided through the fog, blades in each hand. Duff acted without even thinking, swinging his hammer and hitting a rock that was on top of the pile that blocked the doorway. The stone shot through the air, battered with a shocking accuracy, and striking the wraith in the forehead. The creature crumpled to the ground, not moving for several seconds before it slowly tried to push itself up, then slumped back to the dirt, groaning, unable to get his bearings.
"Did you plan on doing that?"
whispered Mary, who peeked around the pile of rocks, a broad grin splitting her usually serious countenance. "Would you believe me if I said yes?"
"No, I wouldn't."
"Good for you," said Duff. "Just as sharp as the blade with which you're so skilled." Duff shifted his attention to the right. The wraith who had been standing there was gone. The heavy thumps on the roof and the dirt that shifted down between the beams revealed the creature's location. For almost a minute, the wraith walked and jumped above them, seeking a way in. Then he appeared in front of the cottage again, having jumped down without making a sound. Despite the age of the cabin, the roof was still in excellent shape. Lucky for them, thought Duff. With no other options, Duff assumed that the wraiths would attack through the doorway. He might kill one of them, maybe two of the monsters, if he was lucky, but not all three who still stood, and not if the one who was struggling to regain his feet rejoined the fight. "Do you have any more throwing knives, Mary?" Duff asked.
"I just had the one," she replied. "My dad said I was too dangerous with them. Better I just have one at a time."
Duff nodded. After seeing her accuracy, that made good sense, although if they survived this combat he planned on talking with Benyon about that. This young lady should be carrying as many knives as she could. Desperate times called for desperate measures. He pulled 2 daggers from the sheaths on his thigh. They were the smallest he carried, and a bit longer than what Mary probably was used to. Even so, he was certain that she would make good use of them. She was a natural, after all. He handed them to her without taking his eyes off the wraiths.
"You have earned yourself the right to live, human,"
said the wraith Duff had spoken with before he had injured the creature's hip. Imagining the pain that he must be experiencing, Duff didn't know how the wraith could still be on his clawed feet. "That's very kind of you," he replied from behind the pile of rubble. "Thank you." Mary looked at him as if he were playing the fool. Duff shrugged. The wraiths might be trying to kill them, but there was no reason to be impolite.
"Enjoy the time that you have left, human. We will be back for you. We will not forget you. Count on it."
Silence fell over the small clearing then, the fog billowing as if it were being stirred by a giant hand. Duff stared out into the mist, hoping to glimpse any movement. Yet there was nothing to be seen. The wraiths had disappeared into the grey. Even so, Duff didn't sleep that night, staying back within the door frame, his eyes seeking to pierce both the darkness and the fog, drawn to the slightest sound, the slightest movement. He didn't breathe easy until the sun began to rise, the warm reddish glow revealing that the fog was moving back toward the north. Even then, he and Mary remained within the cottage until every wisp of greyish-white had drifted away. They were lucky to be alive. He smiled when the warmth of the rising sun hit him. A saying from his former sergeant in the Royal Guard ran through his mind. "You make your own luck, because no one else is going to make it for you." Declan had so many sayings that Duff could never remember them all. but there was always some truth to them. For a brief moment he wondered how that crabby bastard who was difficult to like, but impossible not to love, was doing. The man had made it his mission in life to ensure that every one of the soldiers he commanded did exactly as he instructed, exactly how he wanted it done. Duff wouldn't be alive now, if not for the discipline and precision Declan demanded. And once again, Declan had been right. He and Mary had made their own luck against the wraiths, and they were still alive. Chapter 2. A New Start.
"Was there ever a time when you thought that this would be possible?"
asked Aislinn Winborne. She rode on the back of Astuta. The griffin had befriended her after rescuing her from the collapsing temple of the ghouls, the link between the two growing during the last few months, thanks to their many flights together. Although the Caledonians had decimated the ghoul legions in the Winter Pass, there were still a large number of the creatures to be dealt with in the Shattered Peaks, and she much preferred that work to what was required of her as Lady of the Southern Marches. "What do you mean?" Bryen Keldragan asked. Aislinn's eyes narrowed, one eyebrow rising. Her protector seemed to have an almost uncontrollable desire and ability to make the simplest things more difficult than they needed to be, just like this conversation.
"You know exactly what I mean,"
she countered, her eyes gleaming. "I don't know that I do. Do you mean with respect to Caledonia? The ghouls? The where?"
"Bryen?"
There was a touch of friendly menace in Aislinn's voice, which meant that he was beginning to aggravate her, a skill at which he excelled, though one that he had learned should be used judiciously and at the right time, and clearly, based on the look that Aislinn was giving him, now was not the right time. "Sorry, force of habit." He smiled at Aislinn, then turned his gaze back to the weir, one hand gripping tightly to Banshee's feathers, the other stroking her golden neck as they glided along the boundary of the magical barrier. He was using the talent and the seventh stone to check the weir's structure, making sure that the weave was just as strong as it had been when he had put it in place a few months before.
"Maybe you should come up with a less irritating habit."
"As you command, my lady." Aislinn couldn't stop herself from smiling, although she chose not to return the playful banter. They had spent the last few weeks preparing for their journey with little time to talk of anything else.
"So was there a time when you thought that this would be possible?"
she repeated. Bryen continued to examine his creation. Well, not his entirely. The 10 magi assisting him, of course, checking the weave, looking for any hitch that would suggest a weakness. He had spoken with Victor Keldragan, the spirit of his uncle, only the night before, who assured him that he had nothing to fear. Still, he wanted to inspect it for himself, just to be certain. "You mean that we'd be able to do what we're about to do?" he responded, clearly distracted.
"Yes,"
Aislinn replied.
"Even after all that you and I had a hand in during the last few months, that we'd be able to make a fresh start."
The list of meaningful events really was quite extensive, as it ran through her mind. Ending the reign of Marden Belleron, and freeing the gladiators, reaching the sanctuary and reconstructing the weir, entering the lost land, killing the ghoul overlord, and gaining control over the curse, stopping the ghouls' second invasion before the beasts could reach the Breakwater Plateau and then flood the kingdom. "I was hopeful," Bryen admitted as he continued to examine the weir, "but not confident. Not if I'm being completely honest. I thought the odds would catch up to us eventually. They still might." Bryen had a lingering fear that he'd made a mistake when working with the 10 magi to rebuild the weir, that the magical construction was all going to unravel and allow the ghouls remaining in the lost land to invade, which was why they were here now, flying above the shattered peaks to the west. He needed to be confident in his work. But he realized that it was wasted effort and wasted worry. Victor was correct. The weir was exactly what the Magus said it was, a new creation, stronger than the last, never to weaken, never to fail.
You have nothing to worry about. What you did, it will never be undone. The power will never fade thanks to the seventh stone.
How did you know that I was worried about that? Asked Bryen, Aislinn seeming to have read his mind.
Just a feeling.
You think you know me pretty well, he said with a smile also mixed in a gentle challenge.
I do know you pretty well, sometimes better than you know yourself.
Because of the collar? He asked, touching the silver metal that he still wore around his neck.
At first, yes, but not now. Now I know you because I know you.
Her smile said everything that needed to be said as they turned away from the shimmering, almost translucent barrier that flashed when the sunlight struck it. Banshee heading to the south, Astuta right on her wing, having almost reached their destination. A few more minutes passed before dozens of flattened stone peaks sticking out of a billowing fog came into view. Only a quarter of each sandstone pillar was visible, and for some not even that much, the stacks rising out of the floor of the trench, the canyon a mile wide and just as deep. Banshee and Astuta glided halfway into the trench, then landed atop the stone pillar from which a blazing energy shot up into the air, down into the fog, and to the east and west, for as far as the eye could see. Both griffons shrieked a challenge. They sensed the black dragons that lurked far below them, living in nests dug out of the sides of the canyon and the stone pillars. Despite their deadly nature, those creatures were of little concern to the griffons, the black dragons rarely leaving their lairs. Rather, the griffins kept watch for the wyverns. Smaller versions of the black dragons, these animals were known to fly through the fog and then shoot back down. Careful to never risk getting too close to the griffons, although more than happy to taunt them from afar, perhaps even tempt them to come closer, to where the large number of wyverns might have a better chance of earning a kill. This was the first time that either Bryen or Aislinn had returned to the sanctuary since that fateful day when Bryen had crushed the dreams of the ghoul overlord. Of course, he would be the first to admit that he could never have accomplished that task without the help of so many others. After sliding off the backs of the griffons, both he and Aislinn used the talent to search for any threats that might be nearby. That done, neither moved for several minutes. They simply stood there, taking in the quiet. A strange serenity draped over the summit, upon which the most important battle in the last 1,000 years of Caledonian history had taken place. They then walked slowly across the stone surface that gleamed in the sunlight, just like the stone used to construct the eyrie. The almost clear white rock was marred in more places than they could count by a large scattering of stains, many a reddish-brown that had dried over time. Just as many, if not more, were a deep black, the dried blood mixing closest to the 10 columns that surrounded the depression cut into the center of the sandstone pillar, the color reminiscent of the rust-colored pools of acid common in the lost land. Neither felt the desire to rush as they did their best to step around the reminders of that deadly fight. Their thoughts inevitably drifted back to all that they had needed to do to get Bryen to this summit, so that he could rebuild the weir and stop the ghoul overlord. The many clashes with the ghouls, the elders, and the black dragons, and of course all the people they had lost along the way, the friends who had sacrificed themselves for the greater good. Walking through the entrance to the sanctuary, Bryen's eyes flickered over the columns closest to the steps, reading the names of the Magi carved into the stone: Oran Cavo, Clarissa Dumais, Michaela Benoin, Victor Keldragan. They and the other 10 Magi had given their lives after crafting the first weir, and their spirits had aided Bryen in making the second. They were still with him thanks to the 7th stone. Walking down the steps into the excavated oval, Bryen and Aislinn stopped for a few seconds, taking in the 6 pedestals upon which 6 of the 7 stones rested, held in place by barely visible threads of gold wire. The center pedestal, reserved for the 7th stone, was empty, just as it should be. The stream of energy that erupted from the stones blasted into the sky at a steady, unbreakable flow. The incredible power, which also permeated the hollow, made the hairs on their arms and the backs of their necks stand on end. Bryen walked over to the center pedestal, taking the same position he had when he had worked with the 10 Magi to craft the weir. Then he waited, Aislinn watching him from the base of the steps. The power for the weir continued to flow at a constant, unstoppable rate, the barrier itself remaining strong, glassy in appearance, although solid, the shimmering whitish-grey never fading, never flickering. Finally, Bryen nodded, the tension that had been troubling him draining away. Both Victor and Aislinn were correct. When he had last entered the sanctuary, he had disrupted the flow because the 7th stone had joined with him. Now his presence had no impact whatsoever. He smiled, one less thing for him to worry about. He could leave Caledonia, knowing that he had done all that he could to ensure the safety of the kingdom against the ghouls, knowing as well that he could leave his past here and begin anew in the territories.
"You know, he was proud of you," said Aislinn. "He might not have told you. Knowing him, he probably didn't, but he was."
"I know," said Bryen ambiguously. He still wasn't sure how he felt about the Magus because of their complicated past, still trying to come to grips with who Sirius truly was and the role that he had played in Bryen's life during the short time that he had known him. I think that more than anything he was just pleased that we succeeded in stopping the ghouls. That was his primary goal as soon as he assumed his position as Master of the Magi. In the end, he achieved it.
"You're right,"
Aislinn agreed, who walked up to him and took one of his hands in her own.
"He did care about you, though. He didn't always show it. In fact, he probably didn't know how. But he did."
"I know." Bryen couldn't bring himself to admit that he cared about Sirius as well, not really having any desire to delve deeper into those emotions, at least not now. He was willing to admit to himself that he missed the old Magus, wishing he was still here with them. He had never really taken the time to process Sirius' death, always moving on to the next challenge, until finally reaching the point where he now had the opportunity to contemplate the impact that Sirius had on him, both the good and the bad. The Magus had done a lot for him. He had expected even more from Bryen, demanded it, in fact. Sirius had stood ready to kill him if he had made the single mistake that would have allowed the curse to corrupt him. And when it proved necessary, when Bryen's life hung in the balance, the ghouls pressing the blood company and Bryen struggling to craft the weir, Sirius had stood against the ghoul overlord, even though he knew that he was going to die, giving Bryen the extra minutes that he needed, sacrificing himself for his grandson.
"He was the hardest tutor I ever had," said Aislinn. "He was the cranky, irascible uncle I never had. He pushed me every day."
"I know.
I was there for a part of it. There were times when I hated him. She could sense that Bryen was experiencing many of the same emotions that she was, and she hoped that talking about it would help him.
Me too, Bryen replied in a soft voice.
I loved him too.
I don't know if I would go that far, murmured Bryen with a shy grin.
Everything he did for a reason.
I can't dispute that.
I know, you don't have to say it. He pushed me because of my skill as a magus. He did the same to you because of what happened with the 7th stone. He wanted us both to succeed. For us.
I know, but it wasn't just for us. Aislinn nodded, unable to disagree.
For him as well. Sirius always had a larger goal, a larger purpose. Our success was his success, but there's nothing wrong with that.
You're right. I just wish he had been more honest with us from the beginning. It would have made things easier.
True,
nodded Aislinn, her fingers gently rubbing Bryen's hand.
That would have been asking quite a lot from him, though. He was who he was.
You're using my own words against me again, Bryen said with a smile.
I am, Aislinn admitted. Do you hate him?
No. I just feel sorry for him.
For me as well. A part of me kind of wanted to spend more time with him once all this was done. There were some things that we needed to talk about. It would have helped both of us if we had. Now it's too late. I don't know that he'd be able to teach you much more about the talent.
Not with respect to the talent. Sirius had been his grandfather.
Bryen would have liked to know the answer to dozens of questions he had about his family and himself. Victor had provided those few details that he could during their conversations, but there was a 1,000-year gap that the dead magus now tied to the 7th stone couldn't fill. Not wanting to dampen what had been a good day so far, Bryen shifted to a different topic, remembering too late that this issue had been a thorn in Aislinn's side since she had first told her father her decision.
Did your father try to convince you to stay again?
It was a very muted attempt this time, admitted Aislinn.
She had been thankful for that, not wanting to get into another argument with him. She had grown tired of her father's efforts to change her mind, subdued though they were most of the time, a few episodes more animated.
It would have been a much more difficult conversation, if not for Norsen's gentle guidance.
Her father had been badgering her ever since she had told him that she'd be accompanying Bryen, raising repeatedly her duties as the Lady of the Southern Marches, the responsibilities she needed to fulfill to her people and her duchy. Then, inevitably, his argument for her staying shifted to how much he needed her in the Southern Marches, followed by a host of other excuses to keep her in Caledonia. She knew that he did it not only because of his sense of duty, but also because of his love for her, his fear for her safety. She had humored him as much as she could, at the same time deflecting each argument with a stronger argument of her own for why she needed to go to the territories. That hadn't stopped him from trying, though the energy of each attempt he made faded, as her father began to understand why she had to do this, why she couldn't not do this. He didn't want to hold her back. He was just afraid for her. Even more so, he was afraid for himself, of what life would be like with her gone, if only for a time.
You expected him to keep trying to keep me here, didn't you?
Said Aislinn, raising her sparkling eyes to his, the cold grey sending a delightful shiver through her. I did. I thought that his willingness to commission a ship that would take the Blood Company to the territories was the fastest way for him to get me out of his hair.
My father is sorry for what happened,
Aislinn said, though she wasn't trying to defend her father.
Everything had worked out in the end, better than she could have imagined, all because of her father's decision to make Bryen her protector. That still didn't excuse what he had done, however. That rash decision could never be forgotten, and Bryen would never forgive him for that. I remember the apology. You could be right, said Aislinn, having thought much the same herself, which was why she hadn't told her father that she would be going to the territories until construction of the ship was well underway. Or he could be trying to make amends. Do you really think so? Bryen's tone suggested that he was quite skeptical. Aislinn smiled. I don't know. I do know that you still make him uncomfortable. That's his problem, not mine. I'm not suggesting otherwise. Are you sure you want to go? Bryen asked, afraid to do so, but needing to know, his worries, some real, some imagined, gaining too much traction in his head. They had not spoken about it since she had told him that she had accepted his offer, and that had been months past. You know what you're leaving behind. I do know what I'm leaving behind, responded Aislinn, her voice hard now, challenging. Contained within that tone was the magus who was almost as strong as Bryen in the talent, the Fedra of the Pit. I do know what I'm leaving behind, she repeated, taking her hands from Bryen's, and pulling on the shoulder straps of his leather armor, so that they were nose to nose. I also know what I'm gaining by going with you. She then leaned forward, her lips brushing against Bryen's, tentatively at first, then with more ardor, neither able to control the passion between them that was never far from the surface. Bryen and Aislinn didn't talk much as they flew back through the shattered peaks and then south to Battersea, the capital of the southern marches on the Silent Sea. They didn't feel the need to, simply enjoying one another's company as Banshee and Astuta soared through the sky, the griffins shrieking in pleasure as they revelled in the strong gusts that pushed them to the east, and then across the northern spine toward the coast. As the land rushed by beneath them, Aislinn and Bryen both used the talent to search through the snow-capped mountains. It had only been a few months since the Caledonian army had defeated the Ghoul legions, forcing the surviving beasts back north up the Winter Pass and then into the mountains right before the winter returned after its brief hiatus, and buried the rugged cut in 100 feet of snow. In that short time, the Order of the Magi had been quite thorough in its work, helping the soldiers charged with rooting out the beasts do so with a brutal efficiency. Aislinn and Bryen could sense just a few ghoul packs remaining deep within the spires, in places that, with the worsening storms, would make it exceedingly difficult to reach. Bryen smiled as he thought about that. It was no longer his problem. The ghouls posed a threat, though certainly not on the level that they once had. He had done what was demanded of him. Defeating the elders and the ghouls had required his use of the seventh stone. Eliminating the beasts entirely from Caledonia could be accomplished through more conventional means. Not having that burden on his shoulders gave him a sense of freedom that he was still trying to get used to. So much had been expected of him for so long that he still wasn't comfortable with the fact that his decisions were now his own. He was no longer constrained by larger issues or concerns, or at least not entirely. He could do as he wanted, which might be why he was so unsettled. It was the first time that his life was his own since he had been forced into the pit. While enslaved in the Colosseum, he had thought about what he would do when he was free of the white sand, yet never had he thought that he could turn his dream into reality. Circling the harbor, they looked down at the dock that extended out toward the breakwater, the massive merchant ship commissioned by Aislinn's father tied to the pier, the hundreds of people scrambling around it appearing to be no larger than ants. The vessel truly was a marvel, built according to the Duke's specifications, with several improvements incorporated that were suggested by Duchess Stellakel in consultation with Bryen and Declan. Named the Freedom, the ship was one of the largest ever built in Caledonia, measuring 300 yards long and 50 yards wide. 4 masts, the tallest reaching 150 feet into the air, soared into the sky, a crow's nest on each one. Along the stern were 5 large platforms, each having a retractable shelter for bad weather that extended right out over the water. Right in front of those additional decks, and to each side, was a schooner, each one 50 feet long with 2 demountable masts. They were actually built as part of the larger ship. The railings and hulls connected cleverly, but the smaller vessels could be detached and sailed on their own in just a matter of minutes. When Captain Gregson had first come aboard to assume command of the Freedom, he had stared at the 2 small cutters for quite a long time, not saying a word. They increased substantially the large ship's sailcloth, which meant an extra few knots of speed. He had never seen anything like it before. Large rowboats, fitted for small sails along the side to escape a sinking ship. Yes, those were common on the large vessels used to cross the burnt ocean, a trip that he had made dozens of times. Never 2 small ships that were a part of the larger whole, however. Then his usually sour expression had broken into a salty grin, his sharp mind already working through the many possible ways that he could make use of ships like that. Banshee and Astuta landed on the platforms extending off the ship's stern with a graceful touch. The sailors who scurried about the deck preparing it for the tide watched the animals with a wonder mixed with trepidation. They had heard of the griffins the Protector had befriended, and how they had aided in the defeat of the ghoul legions. Still, they kept their distance, not entirely comfortable with the animals that were several times larger than draft horses.